Xenobiologist Vesa Thren had cataloged the survival instincts of 400 species across her considerable career, and every single one of them, without documented exception, shared the same foundational response to open flame. Retreat, immediate and absolute, a reflex so deeply embedded across every known form of carbon-based life that her own species' emergency protocols treated it as a biological constant no civilization needed to specifically train against. She watched that constant break, in real time, on a security feed from a burning colony outpost, when a human engineer named David Ochieng ran directly into a collapsing structure to pull out 3 strangers he had never met, and she spent the following decade trying to understand what she had actually witnessed. The incident occurred during a routine diplomatic visit to Meridian Colony, a joint human-Voth settlement established 4 years into the tentative alliance between Earth and the Voth Assembly, when a fuel cell malfunction in the colony's primary habitat dome triggered a fire that spread through the structure's ventilation system faster than any of the settlement's automated suppression systems could contain. Vesa Thren, present as part of a Voth cultural exchange delegation touring the settlement's integrated facilities, watched the emergency unfold from a security monitoring station roughly 200 meters from the affected structure, close enough to observe the response in real time, far enough to remain, by every metric her own species' risk assessment protocols emphasized, entirely and appropriately safe. Every Voth colonist within visual range of the fire responded exactly as 400 years of assembly emergency doctrine had trained them to respond: immediate, coordinated retreat toward designated evacuation points. A reflex so deeply embedded in Voth physiology and cultural training that Vesa herself, watching from the monitoring station, felt her own body's instinctive urge to increase the distance between herself and the visible flames. Despite the 200 meters of already substantial separation, she watched David Ochieng, a structural engineer she had been introduced to only the previous day during a routine facilities tour, break from the evacuating crowd and run directly toward the burning structure's main entrance. "He is moving toward the fire," she said aloud, to no one in particular, her translator implant rendering the observation with a flatness that entirely failed to capture the specific, disorienting alarm the sight produced in her. This contradicts every documented survival response across 400 cataloged species. Her Voth colleague, a security liaison named Threl Asvani, who had spent considerable time studying human behavioral patterns in preparation for the diplomatic exchange, offered an explanation that felt, in the moment, entirely inadequate to what they were both actually watching. Human emergency response protocols apparently include provisions for civilian rescue operations conducted by untrained personnel, he said. Our intelligence briefing noted this as an unusual characteristic of their emergency culture, though I confess the briefing did not adequately prepare me for observing it directly. What the briefing had described, in the clinical, distant language of cross-cultural intelligence assessment, as an unusual characteristic, Vesa Thren watched unfold as something considerably more visceral and considerably harder to categorize. David Ochieng, a structural engineer with no formal emergency response training beyond whatever basic first aid certification Earth's workplace regulations required, ran into a burning building he had no professional obligation to enter, toward 3 strangers he had never met, because his own species' internal risk calculation, whatever its actual mechanism, had apparently produced a different answer to the immediate crisis than every other species' considerable evolutionary history had ever developed. He emerged 4 minutes later, considerably longer than Vesa's own species' emergency protocols would have permitted any individual to remain within a structure showing the level of structural compromise the burning dome had already displayed, half carrying, half dragging an unconscious Voth colonist, whose own evacuation attempt had apparently been blocked by a collapsed support beam. He went back in twice more, over the following 11 minutes, extracting 2 additional colonists, human and Voth respectively, before the structure's eventual, catastrophic collapse finally rendered further rescue attempts physically impossible, a collapse that occurred less than 90 seconds after his final exit. Vesa Thren spent the following decade of her considerable academic career attempting to properly understand what she had witnessed, a research project that would eventually expand well beyond her original xenobiological specialization into a comprehensive, cross-disciplinary study of human emergency, behavior that would fundamentally reshape the Voth Assembly's broader cultural and strategic understanding of humanity's actual psychological architecture. My initial hypothesis, she explained, during a formal presentation to the Assembly's Cultural Integration Council 4 years into her research, assumed David Achiang's behavior represented an unusual individual anomaly, perhaps reflecting specific personal psychological factors unrelated to any broader human characteristic. This hypothesis proved entirely incorrect. I have since documented 43 additional confirmed incidents across a dozen separate human settlements and vessels within Assembly-monitored space, involving civilians with no emergency response training entering active fire hazards specifically to extract other individuals, frequently strangers, at demonstrable personal risk. Their own species' cognitive architecture apparently does not process the way every other cataloged species processes equivalent danger. Council member Vesrek Thalon, reviewing her preliminary findings with the particular analytical skepticism his position demanded, pressed for clarification regarding the underlying mechanism. You are suggesting humans do not experience the same instinctive fear response to fire that every other documented species experiences, he said. This seems biologically implausible, given fire's consistent and considerable threat to any carbon-based organism, human physiology presumably included. I do not believe humans lack the fear response, Counselor, Vesa said. That would, as you correctly note, represent a genuinely implausible biological anomaly given fire's consistent danger across all carbon-based life. I believe, based on considerable subsequent research, that humans experience fear in the presence of fire at levels entirely comparable to every other species I have studied. What differs? And what I have spent considerable years attempting to properly document is not the presence or intensity of the fear response, but what humans appear capable of doing with that fear once it registers. She displayed, for the assembled council, physiological data gathered from extensive interviews, and, where subjects had consented, direct neurological monitoring conducted during controlled emergency response simulations. Data that represented, by that point in her research, several years of careful, methodical study into a phenomenon her original security footage had only begun to suggest. Human emergency responders, whether professionally trained or, as in the Achiang incident, entirely untrained civilians, register fear response patterns during active fire emergencies that are, in every measurable physiological respect, comparable to what we observe across every other species I have studied, she said. Elevated heart rate, cortisol release, the full suite of autonomic responses our own biology and every other documented species biology produces when confronting genuine mortal danger. The difference, and this is the finding I believe represents the most significant contribution of my entire research program, is that humans appear to possess a specific cognitive capacity to act in direct opposition to that fear response, not by suppressing or failing to experience it, but by consciously, deliberately overriding its behavioral output through what human psychological literature describes as a specific form of moral reasoning that occurs, remarkably, in real time, during the actual crisis itself. She played, for the assembled council, an extended interview recording, conducted 3 years after the original incident, in which David Achiang, considerably more weathered by the intervening years, but still recognizably the same engineer whose actions had first prompted her entire research program, attempted to explain his own decision-making process during those 11 minutes. "I want to be honest with you, because I think the honest answer is more useful than whatever heroic version people usually want to hear," he said, in the recording Vesa had personally conducted during a follow-up research visit. "I was terrified. I remember being terrified the whole time, every single second I was in that building. I wasn't brave in the sense of not being scared. I was plenty scared. What I remember, more than the fear itself, was this very specific, very clear thought that arrived almost the same instant the fear did, and it was something like, there are people in there who are going to die if nobody goes in, and I'm the person standing closest to the door. I didn't decide to be a hero. I don't think most people who do this kind of thing decide to be heroes, honestly, whatever the news stories eventually say about it afterward. I just had this very simple, very practical thought that somebody needed to go, and there wasn't really anybody else positioned to do it in that specific moment. And once I had that thought, it turned out to matter more to me than the fear did. Not because the fear went away. It really didn't. It just stopped being the only thing telling me what to do." Vesa Thren's subsequent research, extending across a comprehensive decade of study that eventually incorporated interviews with several hundred human emergency responders and civilian rescuers across dozens of documented incidents, identified a specific psychological pattern that would become, within assembly cultural and strategic circles, one of the most extensively studied characteristics of human cognitive architecture in the entire post-contact diplomatic relationship. Human beings, I have come to conclude, possess a specific and genuinely remarkable capacity for what I have termed conscious fear override, she wrote, in the research monograph that would eventually become required study across assembly xenopsychology programs. This capacity does not eliminate or suppress the fear response every carbon-based organism experiences when confronting genuine mortal danger. It exists alongside that fear, fully experienced and fully registered at every physiological level, while simultaneously permitting a separate, apparently independent cognitive process, one grounded specifically in moral or relational reasoning, in the recognition of another individual's need and the perceiver's own capacity to address it, to override the fear response's typical behavioral output. This capacity appears remarkably consistent across human demographic categories, cultural backgrounds, and individual personality profiles, suggesting it represents a genuinely foundational characteristic of human cognitive architecture, rather than a rare individual variation. I have documented this pattern specifically in the context of fire emergencies, given the consistency and universality of fire avoidance across every other species I have studied, but considerable subsequent research suggests the underlying mechanism extends across a wide range of danger categories, wherever a human perceives another individual's immediate, addressable need. The Assembly's broader strategic and diplomatic reassessment of humanity, substantially informed by Vesa Thren's decade of careful research, would eventually incorporate her findings into a considerably more nuanced understanding of human behavior that extended well beyond the original, narrow question of fire response, into a broader recognition of what her research had ultimately revealed about human psychological architecture as a whole. We had previously assessed humanity's documented willingness to accept individual risk on behalf of others as a cultural or ideological characteristic, potentially subject to erosion under sufficient pressure or sufficiently altered circumstances. Council member Thalon noted, during the Council's final formal review of Vesa Thren's completed research program. Your findings suggest something considerably more foundational, a specific cognitive capacity embedded at the level of individual neurological function, rather than cultural conditioning alone. I believe that is an accurate characterization, Counselor, Vesa said, and I believe it carries considerable implications beyond the narrow academic question that originally prompted this research. A species capable of consciously overriding its own fear response, specifically and consistently in the presence of another individual's perceived need, represents something our own considerable cross-species research has never previously documented at this scale or consistency. I do not believe this makes humanity invulnerable to fear, or immune to the kind of psychological pressure that affects every other species I have studied. I believe it means that when humans do experience fear, that fear does not automatically and exclusively determine their behavioral response. In the specific and important way it appears to for every other species within our considerable comparative dataset. This is not the absence of fear, counselors. It is something I have come to believe may represent a considerably more sophisticated relationship with fear than any other species I have had the opportunity to study. One where the fear itself becomes simply one input among several, rather than the singular, determining factor in what a human being ultimately chooses to do. David Ochieng, informed years later of the extensive academic and diplomatic significance his own 11 minutes inside a burning colony structure had eventually generated across an entire alien civilization's psychological research programs, offered a response that Vesa Thren would eventually include as the closing passage of her decade-spanning research monograph. I don't really think about it as some special human trait, if I'm being honest, he said, during a final interview conducted a full decade after the original incident, his perspective shaped by years of subsequent reflection on an event that had, by that point, followed him considerably further into the wider galaxy than he had ever originally anticipated. I think about it as just being what you do when you're standing there and you realize you're the person closest to the door. I don't think that's uniquely human, actually, whatever your research has found. I think every species probably has people who do exactly what I did if they found themselves standing exactly where I was standing at exactly that moment. Maybe what's different, if there really is something different, isn't that we're braver, or that we don't feel the fear as strongly as everybody else does. Maybe it's just that somewhere along the way, across our whole complicated history, we decided that being the person closest to the door means something, that it comes with a kind of obligation most of us feel pretty strongly, even when we're standing there scared out of our minds, and every instinct we've got is screaming at us to run the other way. I ran toward the fire because there were people in there, and I was closest, and once I understood that, running away just wasn't really an option my mind was willing to consider anymore, fear or no fear. I don't know if that makes us special. I just know it's what we do, often enough that maybe it's worth your researchers wondering why, and worth the rest of the galaxy knowing, if it ever comes down to needing to know.